Hello everyone and welcome to the latest ARtillry workshop, our ongoing video series of presentations that dive into VR and AR data and insights. I'm Mike Bolin, Chief Analyst of ARtillry, and today we'll be going over some of the historical lessons we've learned from past tech revolutions and how they apply to VR and AR. Quick bit about me, I'm a 12-year industry analyst, the last 2 years covering VR and AR, and I write for a number of these different publications in addition to running ARtillry's various intelligence products, and you can go to artillery.co to find out more. So to get right into the presentation, as I mentioned, we're angling this around some of the historical lessons we've learned in past tech revolutions and how they apply to VR and AR. So the first kind of historical lesson here is the classic content and hardware dilemma. So I always like to say that we are in an iPhone 1-like moment with VR and kind of where we currently stand. Now, the iPhone 1, 10 years ago in 2007, we often forget shipped with only about 17 different apps. And it wasn't till about a year later in 2008 when the App Store came out that it really started to flourish into a developer ecosystem where we saw many years up till today when developers kind of ran with that initial hardware foundation and brought a lot of creativity and innovation to the platform by building new use cases and new apps and things that we hadn't even thought of when the device first came out. And we're talking about everything from Uber to Pokemon Go to Waze. And the reason I bring that up is twofold. One, we're at a current moment right now with VR where we have, the next decade to look forward to, where there's going to be a lot of third-party innovation that runs with that initial hardware foundation and does lots of creative things to build new use cases, new apps, and things we hadn't even thought of when the hardware first arrived. Now, the second reason I mention it is less optimistic and more kind of cautious and sobering, which is that until we get to that point where we are now, is more of a kind of content-starved scenario. And it's a classic chicken and egg dilemma that we see at early-stage tech revolutions, where on one side, you don't have enough content or apps to really drive substantial hardware sales. Conversely, there isn't enough of an installed base of hardware out there to compel developers and content creators to justify the business case of investing in that content. And to quantify that, the math I've done suggests that the total units of HMD sales to date have been under 17 million. And frankly, that's mostly Google Cardboard. When we look at the Tier 1 HMD class, which are the kind of devices that we're all very excited about, the actual total unit sales are actually under 2 million. Now, they're growing from a very small base, of course, and we're seeing healthy growth, but it's sobering when you compare that to the benchmark that is the current kind of ubiquitous hardware in the marketplace, which is smartphones, which now number 2.6 billion global units. So we're nowhere near that level yet in terms of that kind of next big thing, ubiquitous hardware level. So the question really becomes, how do we get there? And that's about breaking down adoption barriers. And there again, we see a lot of kind of historical lessons we can point to. So the first one is content. And that very much goes back to the chicken and egg scenario I mentioned. Now, content needs to kind of expand not only in volume, but variety. So right now, according to Superdata, 72% of the dollars spent in VR content is around games and gaming. And that's fine. We're very bullish on and supportive of the VR gaming industry. But in order to reach a wider swath of the U.S. consumer public, or the global consumer public, I should say, it really needs to have broader applicability and start to spread out into a more varied group of categories in terms of content and experiences. So, of course, that still is going to include games, but we're going to see that fragment into a more healthy mix of things like media entertainment, social media, communications, and other things that just sort of represent a larger kind of share of our overall day and time we spend with media, and that'll create a larger addressable market for VR and again, more appeal for U.S. consumer purchases. The second big factor is price, which may be an obvious statement, but it's working in a lot of dynamics that are non-obvious. At this point, the highest selling HMD among the tier one is the PSVR. That has a lot to do with its lower price tag, but also its compatibility, because it out of the gate is compatible with 50 million existing PS4 units that are already in the marketplace. We're seeing movement elsewhere, such as the Oculus Rift, where recently it lowered its pricing to $599 from $799 for the bundle of the HMD itself and the touch controllers. But we're going to need to see this move more aggressively towards affordable pricing. If you look at market research, consumer survey data put together by EDAR, it shows that at the current pricing, only about 4% of the consumer public is interested in adopting VR headsets. Now, my prediction is over the next 12 to 18 months, we're going to start to see price points that are more around the kind of sub $500 level. We see a lot of HMDs that are being anticipated from Acer and from LG and from others that build upon the Windows mixed reality platform that are standalone headsets that will come out around that $500 price point. So I think that's going to be key to getting that adoption to kind of continue to tick up towards more meaningful levels. And I think that's going to, one, create a lot of price competition and price pressure. So we're going to see more innovation there. And then two, we're going to see the natural progression of Moore's Law bring some of those prices down. Accessibility is another factor that really kind of comes into play here. I'm very bullish on VR arcades, VR theme parks, and other things that allow consumers easier access to VR experiences where they're essentially renting these temporal experiences as opposed to making that big leap into that kind of upfront multi-$100 hardware purchase. Another leading indicator here is what we see in Asia, where there's a lot of growth of location-based VR installations and models developing. Now, another leading indicator here goes back to my kind of historical theme, in that this is very parallel, very similar, and carries a parallel to what we saw in the late 70s and 80s with arcades. When home video game console ownership did not yet reach ubiquity for lots of reasons of pricing and other things, that really bred a situation where arcades were more prevalent. So we're going to see that same path, that evolutionary path, happen with VR. When talking about accessibility, it's also important to mention mobile VR. And I'm not just talking about cardboard, but that kind of mid-tier of Gear VR and Google Daydream. Gear VR just recently came out with a new version with a controller. It's very much trying to stay competitive with Google Daydream. Google Daydream I'm likewise very bullish on because of the muscle that Google is going to put behind this platform in terms of both its deep pockets and really subsidizing a lot of these experiences to get the ecosystem going. It wants to position itself at the front door of this new kind of medium. And the historical parallel there, again, yet another historical lesson, is this is exactly what it did 10 years ago with Android in the smartphone revolution. So the amount of stock it's going to put behind this and really kind of building its developer ecosystem is going to be something that makes us very supportive of the growth of Google Daydream. And the benefit for consumers of all of this is it's going to raise the quality bar, and then that competition at that tier 2 level will also have some kind of pricing pressures to bring prices down. So this is all going to be good for the industry, good for consumers, and we're going to continue to see that move forward. But more so than any of that, it goes back to the data that I mentioned earlier, those 2.6 billion mobile smartphones in the market that really represent the addressable market for mobile VR, and that just scales so much greater in that nearer term as opposed to those high-end HMDs. And it's important to note that the same goes for AR. It's going to use that installed base of smartphones as really a foundation for mobile AR growth. And we've seen that validated to some degree over the last year or two with things like Pokemon Go and Snapchat 3D stickers and selfie lenses. And though those things aren't true AR, it doesn't really matter. They are doing AR a favor by acclimating the masses to these AR-like experiences and giving them a taste in what I like to call the gateway drug for AR. Now, the biggest milestone, though, that we've seen is about 2 weeks ago when the F8 conference, Mark Zuckerberg proclaimed quite boldly that the smartphone camera is going to be the next AR platform. And platform is the key term there because they're developing a set of tools for developers to build interesting kind of AR experiences. And what's going to come of that is a rich library of AR graphics and AR use cases that really go back to the lesson I mentioned earlier when talking about the iPhone, that's really going to allow this to flourish in lots of different directions as developers take it down new roads. Now, comparatively right now, we have kind of Snapchat with a handful of filters and things like that, and they have a very closed-off system. So the difference here is that this will really tap into that kind of developer ecosystem model to really kind of provide a lot of growth for the marketplace. And things that go well beyond things like, dog-faced selfie filters to really reach more levels of utility and creativity. We're talking apps that let you leave kind of notes for your friends in the real world or append real world landmarks or businesses with kind of information such as reviews or recommendations. And it's really going to go in a lot of different directions. So that brings me to my last point here in these kind of historical lessons, which is native thinking and development. And the historical example I always like to use is the first days of television advertising were simply someone reading a script in front of a camera. And that's simply because that was the way it was done in the previous medium, which was radio. And we've seen this similar kind of habit creep happen in every kind of technological or media revolution. With the smartphone, for example, we see it even to this day, but especially in early days when people try to take desktop media or experiences and kind of shoehorn them into a smaller screen. That essentially describes the entire industry of banners and display advertising. Where it was really built for a different machine and kind of shoehorned into this new feature. So conversely, the apps and the experiences that we saw that had the most success were ones that were developing to the extent of the platform's abilities and really tapping into the unique parts of the form factor, the fact that it has a GPS chip, the fact that it has an accelerometer, and really building unique things that work on that device alone and working very natively. So examples are, again, things like Uber or Pokemon Go or Waze. So the translation to VR and AR is that we're going to see the most success come from the developers that build to the extent of the platform and keep up with that moving target of platform capabilities in VR, and that includes everything from positional tracking to room scale and eye tracking and haptics and touch controls and all of these things that really create that greater sense of immersion. The developers that really kind of keep up with that and, again, develop to the extent of the platform will find a lot more success than those that kind of take 2D media and kind of shoehorn it into an immersive environment. And that may sound obvious, but it's very surprising in these kind of tech revolutions how often that kind of simple fundamental historical lesson is ignored. So that's it from me. I'll put a pause there. I'm available for questions and comments at the information here. We will be continuing to publish ARtillry workshops just like this, as well as a number of other content formats on our daily blog, our weekly videos and interviews with leaders in the space, our weekly newsletter, and lots of other ways we'll be coming at you. So stay tuned for all of that. Email me for any questions, and we hope this has been valuable. Thanks for listening. I'm Mike Boland.